Welcome back to the Write the Docs podcast, episode number 15. Although, just in case you're checking, you haven't missed any. We've been away for a while, and any long-term listeners or watchers will recognize we actually have the original crew back. Life got in the way, as it has a tendency to do. I did actually check. I think the last one was in March, actually, so quite a while. Life has got out the way again a little bit, so maybe let's do a little bit of a round table to remind everybody of who we are. Let's start over in tomorrow with an old face, back in the world of the writer. How are you doing over there?
I am doing well, Chris. Hello, everyone. I return from the land of product, back to the wonderful land of technical writing again. The sanctity, the wonder of technical writing. And it feels good to be back.
And what are you working on, if it's okay to say?
I have joined a company who it's in the financial space, and I'm actually at the moment devising their documentation strategy for the business, which is something I've never done before and is something that I was quite apprehensive about, but it turns out I'm not doing a bad job. So I'm okay with that for now.
Cool.
So not really doing any writing, just doing a lot of planning at the moment and analysis and all this sort of stuff that I don't really enjoy that much, but I know is very important.
And from tomorrow back to the past, as far as I'm concerned, Tom, how are you doing over there?
By the way, these references to tomorrow and the past, most people realize that you're in Berlin and Jared is in Australia and I'm in San Francisco Bay Area that hasn't quite caught up to the rest of the time of where you're at. People might miss that. Anyway, I'm doing well. Not a ton of new stuff. It's a nice sort of summer here. And I've been working on some projects. I've started some new projects and I'm kind of excited about them. And I'll talk more about those later, but yeah, I'm still at my same company, same role, doing more with kind of voice interactivity, I guess, or trying to document how voice interactivity works with different Fire TV apps and things like that. But yeah, I'm excited to have the old crew back here and to get back into the rhythm of things.
Cool.
Me too.
Cool. And myself, I've actually in a period of change as always. I've just wrapped up a contract working with Facebook Messenger, which was interesting in many, many ways, especially during a particular period in time for that company. We'll just leave it at that. And I am switching to something very different and actually doing documentation for the Ethereum Foundation, which, whatever you think about Ethereum and blockchain technologies, is a kind of interesting place to be, and doing very different things in very different technologies and trying to understand it all is an interesting challenge. So that's I think
quite a lot of new and very much shiny in that space. So
not so shiny, but certainly new. So let's kick off into the main topics. I think the overarching theme in the back of my mind is kind of a revisiting a theme that we have covered at various times, sort of, I guess, questioning where writers sit and the roles we play in organizations, but with some specific topics to structure that discussion. So most of these topics were actually Tom's idea. So maybe we'll let him kick off with the first one, explaining what it is, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. So I think it's great that Write the Docs records all the videos. And if you didn't know that, they're totally available. I think they were available like the next day or by the time the conference closed. It was quite amazing. And I've been listening to some of them. One of them that stood out to me as being a must listen to talk is the one by Jen Lambourne called Research Like You're Wrong. I thought this was right on the money. I didn't attend this year's Write the Docs in Portland, but a general theme that people told me the conference had was user research, focusing on the users, which I think is right on target with where we should be, because this focus on the user is what separates and defines what we do. right? We're not just transmitting information. We're communicating with a user and using different strategies and considerations in how we communicate. Otherwise, engineers could just write the documentation, right? If it's just raw information. And Jen's talk, starts out with this claim, this bold claim that, hey, check your assumptions about your users. You're probably wrong, right? We need to do some research to find out just, what they think about a variety of things. And she gets into the nuts and bolts of how to do research. Very good tips, solid tips about strategies and how to analyze it and the time. She even said that for every 2 hours of, interview questions or whatever research you do, spend at least an hour analyzing and processing it. But I just thought it was a great talk. So if you haven't listened to any of them, check that one out first. And maybe let me throw out a question. How do you find out, Jared or Chris, how do you find out if your assumptions about your users are correct or not?
Jared, you started a new role, so I think this might be one I would assume you've been going through right now.
Yeah, a little bit, but at the moment it's mostly internal because we haven't really got a really mature external documentation backplane yet. In fact, we were actually using Confluence to host both the internal and the external documentation, and doing a bit of how would you describe it? Jiggery pokery, I believe the term is, in between both of those instances. So what I've been doing is yeah, you're right. A lot of asking questions, and asking questions is quite difficult. And I think the main theme I got out of Jen's presentation is that you've really got to stop talking, and it's really important to stop talking, and also try not to solution as well. There's coming from the product management space, when you're doing research into something you want to build, excuse me, you've got to be really careful not to put your solution hat on and start to think about ways you could solve the problem. You just need to discover the problem first and let that sort of evolve when you're actually talking to users. So yeah, I agree with Jen's points there. It's actually very important just to just listen, and also don't try to quantify answers as well. A lot of the sort of research that you do when you're doing documentation research or trying to find out whether your documents are doing the right thing or not, it's all qualitative research. So it's like, how does it feel? And what does it do, and where do you get stuck, and things like that, but not how many times does this happen, because you can't interweave that into that sort of research. It's just not possible.
I think for me, I guess I've generally worked at smaller companies where maybe even being the first writer. So sometimes if you said you want to do a big research project, people might be a little bit skeptical about why you need to bother. But in the long run, it usually is a valid thing. I guess as I've usually written for developers, we also have to bear in mind like the phrase I've used before of the end user. The readers of the documentation are developers developing things for other people. So there's kind of two sets of users. There's the intermediate users we're writing for, but then also the people they're creating things for. And sometimes it might be useful to find more out about those as well, especially if your product tends to be used in certain sectors, which, like, for example, Jared, you're very specifically in the financial space right now. Yeah, and I think the other one that stuck out me here was lesson number 14. Don't confuse user needs for user wants. I've seen this actually in other sort of more UX-focused discussions too. And especially all the time. Yeah, and especially relating to lesson 8, humans are really polite. Or you could paraphrase that to say, the loud minority and the silent majority is that just because some people are telling you something doesn't actually mean that many people want it. It's just some person who wants a particular thing and is very loud about it, and it's hard to sometimes block those out.
Yeah, I definitely had that problem when I was doing the product role. We had some very vocal advocates for things, and until we started to get better at doing the product side of things, it was very hard not to actually implement those things just because they had so much clout in the business, and there wasn't any real data-driven decision-making being done at that time, which is, of course, with product, kind of what you have to do if you don't want to make feature factory stuff, which is just, pumping out features for the sake of making features. So, yeah, you definitely got to, not listen to the people yelling the most and try and look for the silent people in the room. And it comes down, when you're doing the interviewing as well, to do quite a bit of what do they call it? It's not behavioral science, but it's sort of like observing people and trying to sort of encourage the people who aren't talking to actually speak up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the other option too is you can actually do things separate. And if you know that there's vocal minorities that are going to be in the room, then you actually go and collect their feedback first, and then you go to the people who may be a little bit more silent and go and get their feedback second. And then when they both come into the room, you have a much better idea about what's going on there.
I think it's an extremely difficult sort of challenge to get access to users. I mean, and different companies have different dynamics, but most places I've been at, they usually the people who interact directly with the users are like the field engineers. But there's lots of different ways beyond just like interviews or talking with them to kind of collect that information. I recently wrote this competitive analysis on a certain product. And what I did is basically I published an app from start to end on Roku, because that's like one of the main competitors for Fire TV, which is what I'm focusing on. Yeah. And it was kind of mind blowing just to go through their entire process. And I realized that, if a user is publishing a Roku app, which many of them are, they have certain language that they're going to be familiar with, whether to call something a channel or an app, certain kind of assumptions and expectations. Are they assuming they're going to have to conform a feed to meet a certain specification in JSON or XML, certain expectations around metrics, and just seeing I didn't actually talk to a bunch of Roku developers or anything, but I could understand what that perspective was based on going through that competitor's product. So yeah, I think there's lots of different ways, maybe in addition to just raw, reach out to users that we can gather information. But it's really important because it informs so much of our planning and our strategies. There's multiple ways that one can go about writing the same documentation, and those decisions we make about those multiple ways is what really defines the art of communication rather than just transmission. And it's impossible without considering the user. So anyway, it's a great talk. So if you haven't heard it, plus she's from the UK. I can't remember what she does.
So this is actually possibly an important thing to mention. GDS is Government Digital Services. So she actually works for the British government, providing APIs to, I think, external users to consume various services. So the interesting thing with them is, of course, they have to be very conscientious about users because they're publicly funded. So if you are making the wrong thing for people, you're kind of wasting public money. So it's actually I think the reason that she talks about the topic quite a lot is they have to be very careful about what they do.
But it sounds like she has a lot of backing and support from her company for doing this, right? Yeah. Whereas if I undertook 80 hours of user research, people would be like, what are you doing, man?
We had a research round before I actually started at Credit Sense, and we have a pretty switched on UX team, and they did user research with actual people in a room, and they had some prototypes done up, and they collected a whole pile of UX research. So the great thing is that if I wanted to go ahead and do external user research, I could probably use the expertise that these guys have to start that up here. And we're Credit Sense is a small company. We're about 50 people. So there's a lot of people who do a lot of sort of combined roles at the company. So it would be interesting. I've never done a docs research project like this before, and actually done a user research project for docs, because, like you said, Tom, most of the places that I've worked at are huge, and they often have abstracted teams that actually manage a lot of the user interaction. And it sometimes is really difficult to break through those walls in the larger organizations. You almost have to kind of beg and hold your head out to ask for permission to speak to customers. And there's like usually a process involved with speaking to customers. Like even at Ladbrokes, when I was working there, we had a voice of customer team there who their job was to call up customers based on their NPS feedback. So the little, how would you rate us from 1 to 10 thing? That's an NPS scale. And based on that rating, they would actually call up the customers and follow up with them. And that was the only way we were getting customer feedback through this team, not directly. We couldn't actually go and ask them directly, which is crazy.
Well, no, I think your experience that you're describing is exactly the experience I've had in every company I've ever worked at. The idea that I could just call up a user, it would freak people out, break protocol, right?
Yeah, totally.
But that's not to say you can't work through other people like field engineers, product managers, voice of the user surveys, and gather some information. So now that you're in, and here's one thing that always crops up. So you're in the planning phase right now, right?
Yeah,
I'm betting
for sure.
that people, as they're thinking, what's our doc strategy? I'm betting these two topics have come up. Should we deliver PDF and should we create video? Maybe or maybe not, right? But these are common topics that come up, and they're of endless debate, right? Like, PDF, it's like pre-internet, people don't need it. It's such a hassle to create. Or video, oh yeah, people think that users want video, but really developers often hate video. And how do you reach a consensus about these two deliverables that are going to consume so much time and energy without kind of prying into the users' heads and figuring out if it is something they want or need, as Chris was pointing out, in terms of learning a system?
That's a good question. You got something on that, Chris?
Working for mostly software companies, and actually at the moment I have the good fortune to be working entirely on open source, which means it's actually fairly easy to find users. Whether they tell you something useful is a whole other conversation, but it's quite easy to reach out to them. We haven't had much demand for offline. Oh, actually, I think so. One of the other companies I'm working for, which is a British company with people spread all over, we've had lots of demand for books, not necessarily PDFs, like actually more of a book, like taking someone from start to finish, and also videos. The videos, because I have done video courses, and they're so time consuming. I like making them, but you do have to really, really be sure, because they're very time consuming, and maybe do them bit by bit. But we have had quite a lot of demand for them. I think we yet to figure out if they're actually valuable or not until we've made them. But there has been quite a lot of demand from a variety of different people. So I don't know how, it's always that how much feedback do you get before you say, yes, we're doing it?
The videos question is insanely divided because, okay, if you look at like research that shows trends, people say that, users want video. It's in higher demand. But at the previous Write the Docs conference that I attended, not just the immediate one, there was a session on video, and a developer writer felt so passionate against a video that she came over and for 20 minutes explained why we should never do video.
Wow.
So it was crazy. After that, I was like, yeah, if you're going to persuade me against doing video, I'm not going to go out of my way to do it, even though I've actually done many videos, and I myself like them.
Same. I like making them too. They're fun to make.
Yeah.
That developer that you were talking to, Tom, that sounds like the vocal minority there. So he's someone with a very, very strong opinion about things.
And that's
I was going to say, look, when I was doing the docs planning for Credit Sense, I actually did But I broke things down to a concept of documentation types. So for each type of documentation we were going to produce, like, for example, a video or a targeted feature article or things like that, I made this sort of a thing called a documentation type. And what it had was, I used, as part of the documentation type, I'd already defined the racy roles, because people at Credit Sense, the idea behind Credit Sense is it's not just going to be me doing all the writing, it's going to be the business doing the writing. So we're actually all going to chip in and actually do this for once. And it's going to be a very interesting experiment to try. So to do this, I had to make sure that I had documentation types set up that explained what each thing was and actually provide a sample structure that people can follow when they're actually building one of these. And one of them was videos. And I put the caveat on there saying that there's two types of videos you can do. You can do the very quick and informal videos, and you can do the very formal videos. And I think, Chris, your experience sounds more in the formal space, where you have like post-production involved and you have a lot of post-editing to be done. And there's often a voiceover artist and, you know, all those sort of really high-end video outputs. Or there's the videos that a trusted engineer would do when they're walking through an installation process, and you maybe put a bump in and a bump out with a descriptive slide or something on them. So I think I'll be definitely guiding people towards the latter first. So they're very easy to produce, very cheap to produce videos that are very easy to iterate on, because if you can quickly replace the content inside the video, like if you keep it to a minute, there's a much better path to actually get that
and
produced.
it's easy to edit. Yeah.
Exactly right.
I'd actually like to pose one other question in this section, the kind of, I think I'm because this is, you're new in this role, Jared. I'm not 100% sure who you're writing for, if you're writing for end users or developers. But at least, okay, good. So at least two and a half out of three of us writing for developers. And actually, I guess in one aspect that Jen also touched on was, I suppose, almost like internal user research. You know, often to begin with, we need to grill developers a lot to get answers to things that aren't clear, assumptions that have been made, things that were never written down anywhere that all the team just know, but no one else outside of that team knows. And sometimes getting that time is challenging. I mean, we can incentivize external users to take part through vouchers and things like that, but incentivizing actual internal team members can sometimes be even more of a challenge. And I wonder how you've ever found actually getting the engineer and developer time to make your docs better as well.
It's a tough one. It's because these guys, of course, you're right, they're in sprints. We do 3-week sprints at Credit Sense, and they're busy all the time. I mean, even I'm busy, and because I'm fitting into the 3-week sprints as well with a set of docs tasks I need to do for the planning stage. And I'm going all the time. I don't really have time to do anything that isn't part of my sprint plan. So, you know, if I'm trying to take time out to talk to a docs guy about how I think something should be structured, then number one, I have to account for that in my time log. And number two, you know, it's it's a punishment to actually do it like within sprint. So you almost have to like target when you're going to talk to people about these things just when sprint ends and they got this slight lull when they don't really have any tasks to be doing as part of a sprint, and you can sort of catch them maybe informally in the kitchen. I often do that a fair bit. I just go into the kitchen, grab a coffee, and just go, "Hey,
coffee machine off. I'm not turning it back on until."
That's right. I'm holding it ransom. No, we're pretty good at Credit Sense. They look after us well, and we have the kombucha drinks and stuff like that. So I think Credit Sense runs on kombucha at the moment. So I should just basically hide all the kombuchas and say, right, you get a kombucha when you start answering questions for me.
Well,
that's one of my pet peeves, honestly, that this issue you brought up, Chris, is when there's no time allocated in the developer sprint to reviewing or addressing docs. And so it makes it this extra hobby task when you want them to do a doc review. Nobody's got time. And it's like, they don't, because they're so focused on what they've committed. It's just crazy. Like project managers really should allocate some amount of time to documentation, reviews, and production, whatever, because otherwise it frustrates technical writers. Anyway, that's sort of another topic.
Well, I think this actually segues us beautifully into the next topic. I hadn't actually planned it this way, but it seems to have worked out. Again, actually, Tom, because this is actually it's a rewriting of a post, someone else's post on your blog. So maybe if you introduced it, and it's kind of going right into this subject. So if you introduce topic 2,
sure,
and we'll go on.
So this is an article that Emily January Petersen, she's a professor at Weber State, talked about. It's called "Combating the Make It Pretty Philosophy," and it's like a lighter version of an article she published in a journal. And she's talking about what she did is she went and talked to a lot of women in the workplace. She focuses on some feminist topics. And so I think that's why she kind of zeroed in on the women aspect. But she talks to professional technical writers in the workplace and is just kind of evaluating what stereotypes, myths, generalizations they encounter, if any. And she found that there's a kind of an overabundance of stereotypes that they run into about the work of a technical communicator being merely cosmetic. You're making something pretty, you're fixing the grammar, you're correcting my spelling, you're formatting it, or secretarial, almost like, here are the technical writers. They are going to document this awesome, cool, brilliant code that we created. Just go do it and be done with it, and leave me to my alpha space, and other reasons, right? And I like this topic and article in part because I think, of course, now I'm not a minority, so I don't really run into as many probably stereotypes as other people, but I think that we have a challenge to define our role and what we do in terms of others. People will sort of script us into this subordinate position where we're just these scribes that make things pretty. And it is our challenge to show them that it's more than that. Just last week, I had some developers reach out to me. So I work with a lot of different teams, and these teams, I don't even know they exist. They'll just reach out to me and say, hey, we've got some documentation about this new feature. We want you to publish it. Can you clean it up, take a look at it, and then push it out there? And they sort of expect me to turn this around in like a day and a half, because in their minds, the content is already mostly ready. And I love going through it. And I'll add all these comments, starting with like the choice of language and assumptions about what developers should know and questions that I have and inconsistencies. And my favorite one is, how does this fit into the other stuff on our doc sites, which I know they haven't read, right? They have no concept of whether they're repeating something or they're contradicting another article. There's so many questions that I have. And so I'm trying to redefine this subordinate position of me being a scribe who merely formats and corrects grammar and spelling into a content and knowledge kind of creator of some kind.
Or maybe like a documentation product manager, dare I say it.
Well, yeah, to some extent. So you have different roles, and Chris, you're more of the freelance person, right? Yeah. So I don't know how often you encounter this, or Jared, but what are the scripts that other people have in their minds that they've sort of written you into? Are you a subordinate scribe? Are you a key decision maker? Are they looking to you for what should our approach be? Or are they looking to you for when can you format and push this out?
It has very much depended who I'm working for. I have often come in because it has chugged along with developers just writing stuff, thinking that was enough. And then they get to a point where they've had enough complaints and confused people that they realize that actually they can't make it make sense. And you kind of come in to try and rescue it and fix it. And then they actually sort of value you in some respects. It's weird because probably one of the two of the main clients at the moment are very polar opposite to each other in that one, I pretty much just write docs. I ask for feedback, I get none, and I publish it. And the other, I get so much feedback that I haven't said what to do with it. So it's a very mixed bag. Yeah, I think it really, really depends on the company, the sort of product. I've often found that like SaaS kind of model companies are much stronger on understanding user experience because it's very important to bring the money in. Whereas more purist developer tools, maybe they're a little more reluctant to begin with because they don't necessarily see that direct correlation. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to have to give the classic engineer answer and say it depends.
It depends.
But generally, you are treated like a bit of an oddity, especially because I used to be a programmer. A lot of engineers are like, why don't you do that? It's just the same.
There's another article I was reading on project management language where an academic researcher went and observed sprints, actually transcribed sprints for like 6 weeks at a company, and found that like the technical writer was very quiet. The technical writer's input was like less than like 5% of the entire discussion. And a lot of times the technical writer wasn't present in the sprints, probably because he or she had like 5 other sprints. But when the writer wasn't present, there was some discussion among the project managers about whether the writer would do such and such thing. For example, UX copy. It came up and they were like, is that something the tech writer does? And they're like, I don't know, maybe. You can imagine other topics might come up too, right? Like, oh, we want to put out a white paper or a blog post about this new feature. Is that something the tech writer does? Or is that something we have to get marketing to do? Or even like the whole like design, do tech writers provide input on prototypes? We have to define what we do to other people, because otherwise they simply don't know. It's as if tech writers are kind of this rare bird that people don't really understand and have never worked with. And you like suddenly have to say, no, this is the process and this is what I do. I do a lot more than you think, and yada, yada, yada. Jared, what do you find? You're new in this new role. Are you kind of paving the way and teaching people how to work with tech writers, or do they come at you with like a set of assumptions about what your boundaries and sort of limits are?
When I first started, I did get the classic, oh, could you write this for me? Before I actually started doing the planning. And the good thing is my manager that I report to knows this behavior and kind of goes, no, we're going to put a stop to that now. So you'll be coming to me. If anyone tells you to go and write things, initially at least, tell them to come through me and we'll evaluate whether we should be writing it for them. Because unfortunately, doing their job is part of their job, and writing documentation to support their products in their release is something they're going to have to get used to doing. Because, as technical writers, we know that if you're the only technical writer in the business and you have to do every single bit of documentation, both internal and external, it's like a fire hose, and you can't do it all. You can do it all really badly, or you can focus on one thing and do it pretty well. So they put a stop to that pretty quickly and said, right, we're going to be going into, rather than just dropping you into the middle of the business and saying, let's go and document all the things, they said, let's actually do some planning first and work out what we need to do before we actually just do. And it's been good because at each sprint end, I can actually show the team what I've done in the sprint and go, I'm doing some pretty hardcore planning here. And I'm kind of defining the future for Credit Sense about what we do for our docs. And that reframes my role. It actually almost reframes it to sort of like an architect role rather than, hey, just a writer, or, hey, you can help me do some API endpoints, can't you? And that sort of thing.
I think this is actually quite a challenging position to step up into. I've known a few people who've sort of tried to do it, and it doesn't always work out, because I think that what people think you are just a writer, and actually trying to input more in is sometimes people don't necessarily know how to take it. It's not necessarily good or bad, but putting yourself in the right position to do it.
It's going to be interesting this week.
I'm sure that sentence made any sense. But I think it relates back to the previous topic of actually we often sit between the in our perspectives anyway, between the development teams and the users. And especially on the small projects I'm on, I'm often the first person to even really test things outside of the development team. So I think, yeah, it gives you a perspective there. There's actually one thing here that's sticking in my eye. I don't know if it only applies to me and this subject about where is it? The author Emily mentions, because I work with so many English as a second language speakers, I feel like I get a decent amount of respect in my role.
Oh, and I think these are my notes.
Oh,
sorry.
Oh, that's for you.
Okay. These are my notes on them. But yeah, go ahead.
Because I mean, that's something I do a lot, and I find it quite interesting because, especially in mainland Europe, I'm often hired because people want native English speakers with technical knowledge, and it's a very select and small group of people, to be honest with you. And I mean, I'm flattered, but half the time I'm spending a lot of time with people whose English is perfectly fine. And you're feeling like, why am I so special? But so you have to sort of define other things there, I guess. Yeah, I don't know.
I work with a lot of people from India, and you know, English is not their first language, and so when they do have documentation, they know that like the language is really in need of help. So I mean, they're not just saying, "Hey, polish it up." They're like, "Hey, make it like understandable." And yeah, anyway, so I mean, it really depends on what your environment is and so forth, and who you're interacting with. But at least that's been my experience.
I sometimes feel somewhat inferior. I think all as native English speakers here, when was the last time we were formally, well, maybe I'm asking the wrong question here and about to expose my own stupidity, but when we all formally educated on English grammar, I can't remember last time. So half the time.
I can't remember either.
Yeah, exactly. I think half the time the non-native speakers I converse with have more knowledge of the actual formal structures of the language than I
do. Yeah, anyway. Absolutely. I saw this. This is a very quick aside, but I saw on Twitter the Times had released this really cool interactive editing challenge for their copy, and I will put my hand up openly and say I did terribly at it.
You sure you
terribly? Because I tell you what, the Times editors are on point with what they look for in their copy. Like, it's next level editing they do there, or at least it came across that way to me. And I was very happy to be so terribly wrong. I couldn't find fault in some of the sentences, but they did, and my hat tips to them. So, like, yeah, it was very. And most of the audience, because they actually said, yeah, yes, about 80% of the audience had the same problem as you. It's like, well, yeah, it was a good test, I guess.
We do forget we are doing technical writing, not necessarily creative writing or prose or things like that, which is different. I think Tom is probably more aware of some of the formal specifications around that, but it is actually almost intentionally oversimplified sometimes. So don't put yourself down too much.
Oh no, I wasn't. It wasn't so much that I went, oh my goodness me, like I'm such a terrible writer. It's just that it was interesting. I guess it was actually interesting to see that, in that discipline, the actual the way you edit and the way you structure language, in that, you're right, in that sort of prose way, it's very different to the way we often do things in technical, where we have to almost simplify things to the point of, in some cases, ridiculousness. But it's for our audience, and it's for those people who don't speak English as their first or native language. And it's something that we're looking at doing now. Actually, I've been looking into plain language and writing for translation as part of this thing as well, because we are looking to do some localization. And it's a whole new world for me. I've never actually looked into this part. It's pretty interesting, and it's also, I think, pretty daunting as well to actually essentially change the whole way you write. But at the same time, it's so much better when you get into the habit of doing it, because the way you construct sentences it actually improves your writing for the better, I think. So yeah, that was a bit of a side.
Okay. Has anyone got any other discussion points on this subject, or should we move on to the final one?
I've got nothing else.
Okay. So actually, from one academic related topic to another, I must admit, Tom put this in the notes, and I didn't really understand.
Yeah, sorry, I was the same.
So we might have to let Tom yet again introduce this topic.
Yeah, this is something I'm quite passionate about lately, and it's sort of probably going to occupy a lot of attention on my blog in the coming months, years, whatever. Or hopefully not years, but basically. And here's my tie-in to Write the Docs.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of feel like Write the Docs is missing something. It's this huge community of practitioners, people who are coming together to help each other out. You know, what are the best ways to create and deliver documentation? But the community is ignoring all the academic research, 50 years of academic research in best practices for technical communication that have been done. It's almost like the whole discipline doesn't even exist. In reality, there are hundreds of people who have devoted, countless hours to researching a lot of topics that are important, that are relevant. And I sort of feel like Write the Docs, why are we ignoring this? I mean, granted, most of this content is published in academic journals that, even if you can access, right? You usually have to have some kind of institutional login or go request it directly from the professor. They're tedious to read, but there's tremendous, value and insight in a lot of these that I think we're missing. Conversely, I think academics don't entirely understand the issues in the workplace. They'll often research things that practitioners later look at and say, irrelevant, or I don't care, or this is obvious, or, why bother? This is not even related to what I do. This has led to this sort of divide between academics and practitioners in the same tech comm field. And it's something that a lot of people have written about. Ideally, both groups should be working together. Like, academics should sort of peer into practitioner spaces and solve or research and study problems based on the data that they get, from these practitioners and their input. And practitioners should look at the research and the outcomes and leverage these sort of principles and best practices that have come out of these extensive research projects, because doing so gives you more of a leg up. For example, just on the Write the Docs last week or a week or two ago, somebody was asking, what's better, 2-column design or 3-column design for API docs? And has there been any academic studies around this? This often comes up. People have a design question. Surely somebody has studied this. I shouldn't have to just guess. Anyway, so in order to, I did this survey because I wanted to capture a baseline of attitudes and find out exactly what do people think? What does each side think of the other? Just get a numerical number. And then I want to launch this campaign where I read a bunch of academic articles and comment on them and engage in these conversations, these interview exchanges with the academics. Not just having them sort of summarize what they already said, but asking them questions about it, deep questions, interesting questions from a practitioner's point of view. And through this exchange, I'm hoping to bring both academics and practitioners together in the same space, and this sort of dialectical model of thesis, antithesis, synthesis sort of brings them more together, remove the divide. I'm pretty confident that this will be a project with impact. It's sort of a social statement about writing. I'm not just trying to discover something. I'm trying to leverage a form of writing through these conversations that will actually change attitudes that people have. And so after, 100 of these conversations or so, I'm going to follow up with another survey to measure attitudes and see if people are more decisive about what they think. So anyway, that's that's what I'm up to there, and we'll see. You'll see some of these conversation sort of formats coming out on my blog, and hopefully they'll spur more discussion and make things more
I think
relevant.
now you've explained it, it makes a lot more sense. And actually, I think I've got a fair bit to say. But Jared, how about you go first?
I actually, this is a very new space for me, so I actually don't have a lot to contribute here. But I think what you're setting out to do is both a lofty goal, but one that sounds really quite interesting to see the end result on as an experiment. I think even in a community as broad as Write the Docs is, with all the different types of documentarians in it, you're right. I think now that you've explained it, we do have a lack of representation for academics in there. And I really didn't really give a lot of thought to the academic research when I was doing most of my writing, but perhaps there are some lessons learned that I don't know I need to learn yet from them. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see. What do you think about it, Chris?
Well, I now I sort of get it. I agree fairly wholeheartedly with Tom. I have to admit, I'm probably one of the people who is somewhat guilty of just plunging myself into the practitioner space, because that's something I've always kind of done. And then I sort of step back over time and actually fill in the gaps. I think, interestingly for me, in a more practical example in my mind, I see this a lot in the engineering space too, especially with the kind of more modern JavaScript frameworks. And again, I've seen it especially in the blockchain space, where people think they're doing something very new and are not aware of a lot of history that has come before them. And I mean, of course, it's hard to know everything, but sometimes there are very obvious things, like the number of blockchain people who know nothing about distributed computing principles, which to me seems kind of crazy because that's what it is. Or, engineers these days that go into the workplace knowing nothing about design patterns and trying to reinvent the wheel. So I guess we could quite easily say that as writers, we can very easily be guilty of the same thing. Writing has been around for a while.
Yeah, this is not new, is it?
So, and actually, I think I now realize I've been drawn upon inspiration from at least two what I consider academic researches. One was actually presented at a Write the Docs conference in Prague 2 years ago from a professor at the University of Potsdam, which is very near to Berlin, about how people read online, which actually was super useful because you kind of it very bluntly applies to practical implementation of how you structure documentation to try to get people to read it. And I think that also feeds into like the things like the F-shape pattern for content layout and things like that, which I think have come from academic surveys as far as I know. But yeah, actually, I find this interesting. I think in some respects, what Tom is trying to do is good because, as he alluded to, reading and even acquiring some of these is quite difficult and time consuming. So if you can filter them and summarize them,
in some cases impossible because you just don't have access to the journals without a very expensive membership.
To be honest with you, I actually think your bigger challenge, based again on experience and a slightly biased experience, might be the other way around, in that I have found that people in academia tend to be sometimes in a bit of a bubble, and can harder maybe to break into and change the practices of than the other way around. Maybe.
Yeah. No, let me just comment briefly on that, because I initially did sort of start out thinking that, these practitioners are completely ignoring academic research. What a travesty. And as I got into it, I think I've sort of come around a bit, at least 50-50, to thinking academics, we need you to wake up because you're not seeing a lot of things. And so in these conversation pieces, I'm trying to really kind of debunk this assumption that the reason practitioners don't read academic journals is due to accessibility of the content. The language is too hard. It relies on too many theoretical concepts that we can't understand. We're just kind of too dumb to really get it. I think I know that's putting it bluntly, but that is a sort of assumption that I think academics have about practitioners and why they don't read the journals. Never mind the fact that they're written in a very tedious and cumbersome to read way. But where was I going with that? Oh, so anyway, I think there's room on both sides to change attitudes. And yeah, we can only benefit. Like, only good can come out of this. It might rock the boat in some ways, but that could be essential.
Never a bad
We're hoping
thing.
to have more like partnerships between the two as well, like research partnerships. I even formed a new like listserv called Academic Practitioner Bridge, so that if somebody has a question, you can throw it out there and academics can like respond, or vice versa. Just to have some kind of communication across this divide. So we'll see where it goes.
Well, look, it sounds like a great initiative. I can't wait to see the results. So good on you for taking the plunge.
Do you know what the first topic is going to be?
Yeah. Actually, I'll publish it tomorrow. It's an article that Carlos Evia, professor at Virginia Tech, wrote on lightweight data. He's actually one of the more techie academics, and he's involved in the OASIS committee with data. One of the questions I've had for the academics is, data has been hugely transformative in the tech comm space. Where's the academic research on whether it's been beneficial? It seems like they sort of missed the boat. Beyond Carlos, I don't know that many other practitioners who have been sort of evaluating whether data is worth it, kind of. And he mentioned that actually there has been quite a bit of research on single sourcing and other kind of content reuse. So in the larger umbrella, there has. And so that kind of exchange, helps us see a little bit better from both sides.
Yeah, definitely. That's going to be a very interesting article to read.
Oops. I'm getting whined at by the cat.
You better listen to the cat then.
That seemed a nice underlining to wrap things up with.
So the cat's essentially playing you off.
Like, come on. This is
nom time. Come on, Chris.
All right. So there was an interesting discussion. Good to get the gang back together. That said, the gang is a flexible gang. If you wish to join our gang in the future, then please do. Co-hosting, or just to come and talk about a particular topic or project you've been working on, or just to come and talk about someone else's project. We are open to having you on if you're willing to fit into one of our time zones. It should be okay. We've got most of the globe covered here, so it should be okay. And how you can do that, we have the podcast channel on the Write the Docs Slack if you are on there, or we have writethedocspodcast@gmail.com for email contact. I feel like there's another way, Jared, and I'm not trying to trick you here. Is there? I don't know.
Well, we've got the website, of course, which is podcast.writethedocs.com.
But there's a form too.
Yeah, that's right. And we've also got we're syndicated through pretty much all the podcasting networks, primarily through Stitcher.com. But that means that we just, from Stitcher, it just broadcasts everywhere. So it's iTunes linked, and you can just get it on any podcatcher. Like, I can see the show turning up on Pocket Cast for me on Android. So you just search for Write the Docs Podcast in your favorite podcatcher, and we'll be there for you. And
while you're there, please rate and review. That always helps people find episodes as well when they're looking for particular things.
Yeah, that's really important.
I don't know, does anyone want to reach out to give people personal details, or just the podcast channel? I don't mean I say personal, I don't mean your address or something.
Look, people can ping me all the time if they want on Twitter. I'm at Jared Morgs on Twitter. And you can go and follow me on the LinkedIns if you want to follow me on the LinkedIn. So I publish a lot of Medium articles relating to the Blockade Pinball podcast, which is still going. We're still doing that. So it's fun. Keeps me busy.
You can reach out to me on at Tom Johnson on Twitter or Slack, or at my blog, I'dRatherBeWriting.com.
Just to confuse you, I am at Chris Chich on Twitter and at Chris Ward on Slack. I'll leave you to decide which one is my real name and which one is my internet name. But anyway, so it's good to be back. Hopefully we will keep things nice and regular again. We sort of threw this episode together fairly rapidly in a sudden rush of enthusiasm to get things back. So we haven't really got the next one planned quite yet. So please do let us know if you have something you'd like us to discuss, and we'll be happy to do so. And we'd love it even more if you joined us. So yes, until then, go and have a listen to some of the previous episodes if this is new to you, and join the Slack discussion around this episode. And yes, in the immortal words of Jared Morgan, I'm going to claim them as yours.
They're not mine. They're not mine.
All right, anyway.
No, I think they're Mikey Ariel's.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
And actually, sorry, yes, just to very quickly say, in case we don't come back in the near future, the Write the Docs Prague is on in the second weekend of September in Prague. I will be there. I'm heading up the social media this year, so don't blame me.
I should actually do, if you'll entertain it, a quick plug for the Write the Docs Brisbane meetup, which is happening in August, at the end of August. So go and check the meetup space for that, the one for Write the Docs Australia. I'll be speaking, and Credit Sense will be hosting. So there'll be pizza and food. So come along.
Pizza and food.
And food. Yeah. Or pizza and drinks, sorry. Yeah.
All right, then. So in those immortal words, docs or it didn't happen. And we'll see you next time.
See you later.
Bye-bye.